I'm ahead of the curve. In this book review, I will be discussing R.D. Laing's The Divided Self, first published in 1960. This watershed work aimed to make madness comprehensible, and in doing so revolutionized the way we perceive mental illness. Using case studies of patients he had worked with, psychiatrist R.D. Laing argued that psychosis is not a medical condition, but an outcome of the divided self, or the tension between the two personas within us. One, our authentic, private identity, and the other false, sane self that we present to the world. It also says here that Laing's radical approach to insanity made him a cult figure in the 1960s, yet his work was the most significant for its humane attitude, which put the patient back at the centre of treatment. There's been a lot of, in the past, of psychiatric sort of medicine and the approach to therapy, there's been a lot of controversial methodologies to how to treat the patient, how to cure them. I have come to the point where I would be careful in using the word cure, because that would assume that everything is done and dusted, and we are not, well, humans are not the sort of entities that can even be fully dusted off. We can't be perfect in every way, or even in isolated ways, I think. We can only be the best version of ourselves. And so this idea of perfect is very misleading. So according to Laing, we have the unconscious capacity to create a false self in order to protect the real self. And he wrote the following: "It can be stated in its most general form as the denial of being as a means of preserving being. The schizophrenic feels he has killed his self, and this appears to be in order to avoid being killed. He is dead in order to remain alive." So Laing explains this dichotomy of pretending to be dead inside, I suppose, as a unconscious condition, this being a actual preservation to keep the true or the real self in a sort of balance in the unconscious realm of our mind. So the false self is the surface of our embodiment, our manifesting behavior, and that manifesting behavior is false, because if the real self was exposed in that moment afterwards to trauma, or at the time of the trauma, it would be too much existentially. So there has to be a false sense of self that feels real, but it isn't the real self, because basically if the false self is crippled, then at least the true self, the real self, is still, as I said, preserved. And of course, as you may be thinking, yes, this is a kind of defense mechanism, the sort of branch that Freud would be talking about in his psychiatric id, superego, ego, the sort of stuff that he was sort of talking about. And this is very much influenced from Freud. I mean, Freud, as many people like to say, was obsessed with, well, we know what he was obsessed with. And you see, the YouTube algorithms won't get me there, right? No bad words, no bad words. What Laing does is use a bit of that, but not too much, because as we know now, he went a bit too far. Jung was right. What he does, and this is what we all do really in the psychology field, in the psychiatric field, is use the corpus, the body of Freud's concepts, to understand the deeper mechanism that we are trying to find. Let's say in schizophrenia, there are many things that Freud talked about. Freud was the one who sort of developed the word hysteria, for example, that Charcot used and diagnosed his patients with. Charcot said, well, anyone acting in a disorderly fashion is exhibiting hysteria. I talk a bit about this in my Myth of Mental Illness review by Thomas Saz, if you want to check that out. That was a year and a half ago or something that I reviewed that. Mental illness has really gone a long way in the sense of us not viewing mental illness as this sort of superficial hysteria, you know, people panicking and depression being hysteria, or different types of mental illness being hysteria, you know, just any disorderly mental and physical manifestation of that would be called hysteria, because it was just different, I guess, to the normative mode of being in society. And that was how they sort of made the excuse to put people in psychiatric hospitals and not even treat them. There's loads of things, interesting things about that, probably in another video somewhere. I won't go too much into it, but what I'm trying to say is that the origin was very much from this idea of hysteria, and then Freud develops even more and saying, well, there's deeper levels of this. You know, there's the unconscious, the id, the ego, superego, like I said. Laing does a great job of developing those original ideas, those concepts, and linking it to schizophrenia and uncovering this divided self, that actually there is more to mental illness than mere hysteria, and even what Freud sort of suggested as well. There are actually different selves of us that we use to cope, basically, as defense mechanisms to traumatic experiences. And he does this throughout the book by mentioning many case notes, and he diagnoses them with the divided self in each, and analyzes and goes quite deep actually into their life and psychoanalyzes their life story and explains why the divided self concept is in relationship to the events of that individual. It's really interesting because he does talk about many different clients. Some cases are much more interesting than others, but the way that he analyzes and diagnoses the divided self between all of them, I found to be very, very interesting. He did also reference Kierkegaard's Unto Sickness and Death. I haven't read that one yet, but I plan to. I like his Fury and Trembling, as you guys know. But yeah, that was referenced as well. And apparently, well, Kierkegaard was even mentioned insofar as an actual quote, a direct quote, in saying that an understanding of a patient's schizophrenia can only be done once that psychiatrist understands despair as a concept, as an existential concept. So he was linking schizophrenia to despair, and how we can understand that mental illness in particular by understanding despair as an existential concept. This reminded me of Carl Rogers, in the sense that, as I mentioned before, Laing is using a very humanistic approach, which is it being more susceptible to the needs, the personality, the intrinsic motivations of the individual, instead of viewing the individual as sort of a moist robot that is there to just diagnose and that's it, which is kind of what we do a lot these days. But anyway, we haven't moved too fast from that. However, but Carl Rogers was interesting because he wrote a book on becoming a person, which I did read but I didn't review. But it was a very interesting one in terms of being, as like this one is, a revolutionary sort of book, a piece of literature in psychology that pushes the humanity of an individual, the importance of talk therapy, I mean, being more personal with your client or your patient, instead of, like I said, viewing them from an external robotic sort of perspective. And Laing is adopting that mentality, but he's also putting his spin on it, making it much more existential. And the reason why it's existential is because Laing includes philosophical concepts, and he talks about these different selves. And of course, our personality is very much linked to what has happened to us and how we think about those events. And that leads on to philosophical concepts. The self is very philosophical. I mean, it's a philosophical question at the end of the day. So I found it really, really interesting how Laing mixed philosophy and psychology together to sort of accumulate this idea of the divided self. Laing wrote the following about his style of therapy in connection with his work in schizophrenia. The task in therapy then comes to be to make contact with the original self of the individual, which, or who, we must believe is still a possibility, if not an actuality, and can still be nursed back to a feeble life. And Laing elaborates this sort of existential humanism in another paragraph that I'll read out to you here. The need to be perceived is not, of course, purely a visual affair. It extends to the general need to have one's presence endorsed or confirmed by the other, the need for one's total existence to be recognised, the need, in fact, to be loved. Thus, those people who cannot sustain from within themselves the sense of their own identity, have no inner conviction that they are alive, may feel that they are real live persons only when they are experienced as such by another. Here Laing was also noting how people in this schizophrenic mentality, or in this mentality of mental illness in general, I'd even say, they need a human connection. And this links back to why humanistic psychotherapy is so important. And that's why I personally have witnessed its importance being predominant in somebody's recovery. This is because it is centered on intrinsic values and how that person can move forward with what they've already got, instead of some sort of ideology of what they can be, which is actually the disadvantage of CBT, which is cognitive behavioral therapy, because CBT assumes that somebody is missing something, whereas DBT, dialectical behavioral therapy, is centered on emotions and what the person already has within them. So it can, in a sense, verify their identity much more than CBT can. But that's a very contentious psychological idea there. Laing has his own spin on what consciousness means in relationship to this divided self when he writes the following. Consciousness is then a type of radar, a scanning mechanism. The object can be felt to be under control. As a death ray, consciousness has two main properties: its power to petrify, to turn to stone, to oneself or the other into things, and its power to penetrate. Thus, if it is in these terms that the gaze of others is experienced, there is a constant dread and resentment at being turned into someone else's thing, of being penetrated by him, and in the sense, in someone else's power and control. Freedom then consists in being inaccessible. So as you can tell, there are parts of this book that are very dense, but most of the time it is fairly concise, clear. He doesn't necessarily waste his words, per se. Yeah, I'm still trying to figure out everything that he was even writing in the piece myself. The merit of this book lies in how, well, we can compare the methods from the past to now, and Laing, Freud, Charcot, you can really link all these guys together, Carl Rogers, Maslow, for example. And I also think that Maslow's self-actualization concept is very much reminiscent of this one as well, because Laing is saying that once we become our true self, or we get through the hurdles from our false self to the true self or the real self, we can then, by implication, self-actualize in the same sense that Maslow meant it in his hierarchy of needs. The central thesis of this piece then is, by becoming aware of this divided self, we can transcend trauma by overriding the false sense of the self and become the true or the real self once these building blocks are placed, and these kind of methods that Laing has discussed, once they are realized, something can then be done about that person's divided self. I would recommend this piece if you're particularly interested in schizophrenia or mental illness in general. I would also say that it is rather interesting too if you're involved in the history of psychiatry and psychology. And if you like philosophy as well, that kind of helps, because as I said, the theories of Laing sort of are stemming from philosophical concepts such as the self, as we know. Yeah, I would say that this one is worth checking out if you have interests in the above. That's about all I want to say about this piece. I thought I'd share my thoughts on it with you guys. As I said before in my Last Executioner review, I want to talk more about psychology because I do a degree on it, and I'm working in the industry right now this year for the NHS, and I should probably be revising some ideas anyway. So if you enjoyed this review of a psychology book and you want to see more, just let me know. If you've got any good recommendations for psychology books for me to check out and review, to talk about, then let me know. I've been ahead of the curve. Check out the Bastard Sons of Oedipus podcast if you have not already, where we talk all things existentialism, world affairs. We basically just talk it until you exit the video. It's a bit of fun. So if you haven't checked that out already, go view that. My Patreon is also in the description. You can sign up for a measly £3 and you can get access to many benefits, my writings, early content, my short films, the few that I've done. So yeah, check out the Patreon if you want to donate to me. And my social media links are also there, my Instagram and my Goodreads, where you can track which books I read, when I read them. You can see all my favourite books list and all that kind of stuff. Yeah, if you're interested, if you're obsessed with books like me. I've been ahead of the curve. Thank you as always for watching, and ensure that you don't manifest a divided self. I'll see you next time. Au revoir.